So just as a reminder of why it's important to conserve soil, is soil forms very, very slowly over thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And so in many ways, soil is a non-renewable resource, which means that if we lose it through things like erosion, it's very hard to gain back. And that's especially true here in Appalachia, because we have a landscape that's dominated by steep hillsides, which increases the likelihood that whenever we get heavy rains, like we often do, that water can erode the soil and bring soil particles down and wash them into rivers where they're carried away. So that steep slopes and heavy rains make Appalachian soils particularly vulnerable to erosion, which makes soil conservation really important here. So when we think about soil health, it's really the capacity of soil to function as a living, vital ecosystem that sustains plants and animals and humans. And it is composed of physical, chemical, and biological properties. But these are very much interrelated, as I mentioned previously. So the physical structure makes it a good habitat for soil biology. Soil biological life supports chemical fertility, and chemical properties can also help support soil biology. So all of these factors are very integrated. When we look at the structure of soil, it's composed of worn down rocks. Those weathered minerals are really what makes up the sand, silt, and clay that make up the inorganic part of soil. And that's about 40% of the soil volume. There's about 5% of organic material, but it's playing a very important role. And then hopefully, if the soil has good pore structure, there's a lot of space that is either filled with air or water that's available to help water move through the soil and infiltrate well, and have air available for roots to respire, because roots and microbes, that all the life in the soil, including the invertebrates, they need that oxygen to live and breathe just like we do. So the mineral particles and the organic matter and the microorganisms come together to make up soil aggregates, which are the functional units of soil. Soil texture is going to be determined by the proportions of sand, silt, and clay. Of course, sand is the largest particle size in soil, so it's big enough for you to see with your eyes. Whereas silt and clay particles tend to be much smaller, and clay particles are teeny, teeny, tiny, and they give soil a fine texture. So depending on the balance of sand, silt, and clay, that determines whether a soil is dominated by clay, which we would call a clay soil, or if it's dominated by sand, which would be like a sandy loam, or a silt, which would be called a silty loam, or ideally what's considered optimal for most agricultural practices is like a nice mix of all three particle sizes, which creates that ideal loam. Most of the time in West Virginia, we tend to have finer texture soiled, so more clay loams and silty loams. The soil texture influences the physical and chemical properties. So a coarse textured soil that has more sand in it, and this is also going to be more common on the hilltops where you'll have these coarser textures, tends to have larger pores, which can be a good thing because it allows water to infiltrate more readily. But the downside of that is water also leaves more easily. And so that they can be more prone, growing plants there can be more prone to drought. Whereas a finer textured soil is going to have smaller pores. So the water moves in more slowly, but those soils tend to retain water better and they can hold more water. However, the finer texture is associated with a greater risk of compaction. So those little clay and silt particles and the small pore spaces are more likely to get compressed with the air or water squeezed out of them. And that can cause problems for soil health and create a recipe for erosion. So fine textured soils, because water infiltrates slowly, they can have more surface movement of water during rain, which can be associated with greater erosion. Soil organic matter, while it only composes a relatively small fraction of the total soil volume, is actually incredibly important for the function of the soil. It supports the biological diversity within the soil, so everything from bacteria and fungi through to microscopic animals like invertebrates as well as worms. It also supplies nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and it promotes that physical structure by helping aggregates hold together and acting as a sponge that can absorb and release water. If we dig a little bit deeper into what soil organic matter actually is, our current understanding is that about half of the organic matter in soil is particles of partially decomposed plant litter. So little bits of leaves and roots that are broken down. Some of those are free in the soil environment, and others are trapped inside of aggregates. So when organic matter gets trapped inside of aggregates, that slows the decomposition process and can help it stick around longer. And so that's one way that good soil structure can, promote soil organic matter stabilization. The other half of organic matter in soil is formed from microbial products. And this organic matter is associated with the surfaces of minerals. So whenever organic matter is on a clay surface, for instance, that kind of protects it from further decomposition. And so in this way, that carbon can stick around for a little bit longer. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So the amount of organic matter or organic carbon that's in a soil is really a consequence of how much comes in and how much goes out. So you can kind of think about the soil as like a bathtub, right? That has water, by which I mean carbon coming in all the time and leaving all the time. So it's going to be coming in from plant inputs with both litter and roots exuding carbon. And it's also going to be leaving all the time as microbes break down that organic matter and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. How much organic matter or organic carbon is present in a soil can really be dramatically impacted by agricultural practices, so how that soil is managed. If we think about, that bath cup or cup analogy with soil carbon, a severely degraded system is only going to contain a small fraction of what that soil is capable of holding, right? So there's a lot of potential there to bring that carbon back up. Whereas a conventional system, conventional crop farm, has oftentimes lost about half of the carbon and nutrient storage that it could otherwise have. But a well-managed livestock operation or an organic farm where you're having a lot of organic inputs to the soil can actually maintain a high level of soil organic carbon and nutrients. So just kind of as an illustration of how agriculture can influence soil organic matter negatively, this plot shows how two different farms lost soil organic carbon over time. And you'll see that compared to what was there originally, conversion to agriculture can result in a loss of 25 to 50% of the amount of organic material that was originally in that soil. And not only does that mean that there's negative effects on soil health, but it's also going to mean that that land is not going to be as productive as it would be if it was well managed. The organic matter in the soil serves as support for the soil food web. So in soil, there's a whole complex ecosystem of bacteria and fungi that are breaking down the plant material coming in, and then they serve as a food source for the larger soil organisms like little worms, which we call nematodes, and those worms are then food for invertebrates like insects, and it supports the whole food chain until eventually you start to see the organisms you recognize like birds that rely on the worms and insects living in the soil. So I've been talking about how microorganisms break down organic matter in soil, and this returns carbon to the atmosphere. But they're also important for stabilizing soil carbon. So they help generate some of that long-lasting mineral-associated material that I mentioned previously. So I want to explain a little bit more about how this actually happens. So if you think about where microorganisms live, they live inside soil aggregates on the surface of those sand, silt, and clay particles. And so they situate themselves in these little microenvironments, and they actually function as a glue. They produce sticky substances outside of their cells that we can actually see under a microscope. And this benefits them because it allows them to stay in a favorable habitat, but it also helps hold the soil together and enhances that aggregation, especially at that small micro aggregate level. If we zoom out a little bit more, hyphal fungi, which are larger than bacteria, can wrap around and enmesh soil aggregates and help hold the larger macro soil aggregates together. So just as microbes help promote aggregate formation, aggregates can actually trap organic matter. So as I mentioned previously, there's a lot of that particulate organic matter that's trapped in aggregates. And the reason that that makes the material more stable is because it physically separates it from decomposers that would otherwise break it down. So you can imagine aggregate's going to have all these teeny tiny pore spaces. And whenever you have material trapped inside there, maybe the microbe that wants to eat it can't get to it. And that's one of our ways of understanding why these aggregates help protect carbon in soil, and that allows it to serve as a sponge for water and a glue for aggregates and help maintain the soil structure. As organic matter breaks down, it releases nutrients like nitrogen. To go into just a little bit more detail, microbes participate in this process. They produce little enzymes that can actually dissolve away from them and break down big pieces into constituent parts that dissolve back. And then they process and decompose that material, and they will release excess nitrogen like ammonium into the environment. That ammonium is then available for uptake by plants, or if it's not taken up by plants, it can be converted by yet other microorganisms in the soil into nitrate. So both ammonium and nitrate are forms of soil nitrogen, but they actually behave quite differently. Ammonium tends to stay in place because it's positively charged and it will just associate with soil minerals a little bit more easily, whereas nitrate tends to be more mobile. And so if nitrogen isn't taken up by plants right away, if it's converted into nitrate, it's then more vulnerable to being lost from the system through leaching during rain events, or even through other processes that convert it back into a gas in the atmosphere. Another key way that the biology of the soil influences nutrient cycling is through nitrogen fixation. So I mentioned previously that bacteria associate with plant roots in legumes to bring nitrogen in the soil, but there are also free-living bacteria in the soil that can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And this used to be the only way that nitrogen was made available to plants before we had synthetic fertilizers. And it still plays an incredibly important part in maintaining soil fertility and soil nutrient availability. All right, so I've talked a lot about soil organic matter and how important it is for soil health, but what can we actually do to maintain or build soil organic matter? A few major things in terms of increasing organic matter is to up the amount of carbon going in, because it's a balance between how much comes in and how much goes out. So to up the amount of carbon coming in, you can use cover crops, rotational grazing, residue management, so basically adding those plant residues back onto the soil, and add other types of carbon sources to the soil like manures and compost. The flip side is reducing losses. So to reduce losses of carbon, you want to minimize disturbance as much as possible. So that is maximizing the cover of the soil, so there's roots present during as much of the year as possible. Reducing the amount of tillage. It's true that eliminating tillage can be very challenging, especially in a system where you're trying to manage organically or not use a lot of herbicides. The weed pressure is significant, but if you can even just do like a reduced till or a shallow till, that's a much better option than doing a deeper till. And prevent compaction, because compaction disrupts a lot of processes that Kinsey has already talked about. So we've done some research here at WVU that demonstrates the benefits of organic additions for soil organic matter. So we have a long-term experiment that was done on the WVU organic farm where plots were fertilized with compost, and some of them were not fertilized. And we saw that over the many years of this experiment, regular compost additions increased organic matter content by from about 3.5% to about 5.5 or 6%. In addition to compost, manure is another great source of organic matter. In a separate experiment where we've been fertilizing with manure over the last 3 years, we've seen increases in soil carbon relative to unfertilized plots. And the organic fertilization produces increases in soil carbon while conventional fertilizer does not. And these increases in soil carbon are in both those particulate and mineral associated pools, meaning that you get the benefits of having fresh inputs for stimulating the soil food web, but you also have some of that longer lasting organic matter that sticks around over time. Cover crops benefit soil health in a wide variety of ways, which is one of the reasons why they're such a cornerstone of a healthy agroecosystem. And that's because they improve roots, so they keep roots in the soil, and they also add organic matter to the soil whenever the cover crop is tilled in. Keeping roots in the soil reduces erosion. If you're growing legumes, that can also bring in added nitrogen. They can also support microbial communities like mycorrhizae when crops aren't growing. Legumes and grasses often produce as much growth below ground as they do above ground. And all that root biomass can really build the soil organic matter in during the period of time where the primary crop isn't being produced. Depending on what priorities you have in your system or what challenges you might be having with your soil, you could choose between some different options for cover crops, because some produce a lot more below ground biomass, but they might be better for some grasses. Productive grasses might be better for breaking apart and reducing compaction, whereas legumes might be better for improving fertility. Just as a general principle, to maintain soil health, it's important to try to return as many of the nutrients from the soil back to the soil. So if you have a livestock system, if you have animals grazing, to try to return the manures from those animals back to that pasture as much as possible. If you're producing crops, trying to return the plant residues back to the land as much as possible to help feed the soil so that the soil can keep feeding the plants.
So the 4 principles of soil health defined by the USDA are to maximize continuous living roots, minimize disturbance, maximize biodiversity, and maximize soil cover. All those together are basically trying to protect the soil and feed the life in the soil. And if you do those two things, you see a lot of benefit out of it. So we talked a little bit in the field about soil structure and porosity, but the real grit that we want you to take out of this is that without those air pockets and water pockets, that is how roots travel through the soil easily. They can kind of pierce through compacted soil sometimes, but if you want a good stand or a good crop, they really need to be able to get their roots in there. And in these passageways are also those microbial residues, there's accessible nutrients, it's pathways for worms and microfauna to move in. And when you compact the soil, you're basically squeezing all of that space out of it, and you're losing all of those functions. So what causes soil compaction? Obviously excessive weight, whether that be tractors or livestock, and it gets even worse when it's wet. As we saw in that handball test, when it's wet, it's super easy to just completely squeeze the life out of it, versus when it's dry, there's some resistance to that effect. Anytime livestock is on the same ground for extended periods of time, there's going to be some sort of compaction, especially if those plants are never allowed to regrow and to renew their roots. And in my experience, many, if not most, of West Virginia pastures are at least moderately compacted, and a lot of them are severely compacted. Sometimes it's not even something you can control. It's like where they had mined in the past and they brought backfill in and not done it properly, or just from years and years of hay, tractors going over it over and over. The good news is that there are some solutions to this that might take a couple years to see more of an effect, but it will work. But the number one thing we want to do is to prevent soil compaction by never driving on it when it's wet, or having designated, kind of like, hopefully not that big, but sacrifice areas of sandier, rockier soil that takes up not that much space on your farm, and you manage correctly, hopefully maybe like unrolling bales in the winter versus putting bale feeders where cattle congregate around it. Basically just trying to keep things moving. And so reading the signs, water pooling on the surface, plants not being as tall as they should be, or a lot of plants like plantain or ragweed, or there are these plants that really thrive on compacted soils where nothing else will. Or when you try to soil sample like I did and your soil sampler breaks because it's so compacted, which happened to me 3 times in a 1-month period. And we did this kind of in the field already, but you can actually measure compaction and monitor it over time and see if you're improving it with your methods. You can either get a penetrometer, or you can, if you have a good memory and can remember about how hard you're pushing, you can do this on your own. If you go under a fence line where theoretically there's never been or has been very little livestock or equipment run over it, that can serve as your baseline for what your soil naturally is like compaction-wise. And then you can take a comparative reading in your management areas to see how it compares to that baseline. And if you have the pressure gauge, you can use the ratio over time to see how that changes. And I'll show an example of that in a little while. So pasture management, it sounds easy and broad, but it encompasses a lot of separate decisions, sometimes a lot of money, and sometimes a lot of years. But you have to consider your stocking rate, or how many cattle you're putting on it, how long those rest periods between grazings are. Are you haying or mowing before or after they're grazing? What do you have growing? What types of livestock are you grazing? Are you grazing multiple together? And how long they're on the plot. So it's really a never-ending decision tree. But really, when you break down all the different types of grazing, the most important thing to just keep at the front of your mind is to maximize the living roots and maximize soil cover. Seeing bare ground is, I would say, the greatest indicator that you've overgrazed. And you always want your plants to be at least a couple inches high, I would say. And the reason is that when plants are grazed, for example, like 50%, their roots are actually able to continue to function and grow even with that leaf area removed. Whereas the more you graze, the plant has to compensate and slough off its roots so that the root exudation doesn't exceed its photosynthesis. So there's a diminishing return there after a certain point. So if you have the land to do it, lighter grazes are always better for soil health. And particularly for compaction in winter or wet periods, anything you can do to prevent cattle from congregating in one area for too long, like unrolling bales of hay like this one farmer does, and spreading them out, and he even has it on his like rocky slope that has growth on it, will improve your compaction. And adding that hay has a side benefit of contributing organic matter back into the soil. So it's kind of a 2-for-1. And you're not wasting too much hay if you don't overfeed at a single point in time, and you just give them however much they need in a day or two. So beyond compaction, there are other soil health issues in West Virginia. A lot of the soils are infertile or highly eroded since they're so ancient, and they've had centuries now of logging, mining. There are very, very few native forests in West Virginia. And if you look back at the old logging pictures, like you can see like almost the entire state was without trees at one point. So think about what that probably did to our soil. A lot of landslides, etc. And also because these soils are so old and because of the parent material, a lot of them are very, very acidic. We have some that are below 4 on the pH scale, which is approaching stomach acid. But I've also noticed, not on all farms, but a lot of farmers end up overgrazing their fields intentionally or on accident, where you look out and there's barely anything over 2 inches except for weeds maybe. And because of those decades of overgrazing, the infertility and the acidity, we have a very, very high weed abundance compared to other states, which leads to poor nutrition for our cattle and lower growth. And this leads to worse financial outcomes ultimately. So it's kind of a cascading effect where things kind of snowball out of control at a certain point. But thankfully, most of the solutions don't just benefit one aspect, they benefit the picture of a whole. So when you implement better grazing techniques or fertilizing your soils, you're building organic matter, improving your forage stand, and your overall soil health all at once. So in our experience, all these things are important, but there's no getting around grazing management. It doesn't matter what you do, and I've almost tried to like see how drought impacts forage stands, but I can barely see that effect because the management style so overrides all of it. Even in the drought of 2024, management determined how healthy those soils were and what forages persisted more than any other factor. There's really no substitute for it. I personally feel like that's the #1 goal for most livestock producers in West Virginia. If you're going to start anywhere, is to start with that. Without good grazing management, plants are allowed to regrow and rest in between grazing events, any other changes you make will probably have very little impact, and if they do have an impact, it won't last very long. And so types of grazing, a little bit more. In West Virginia, most producers are somewhere between continuous and slight rotational, where they have like a couple pastures, usually just because of the topography, where they have one field on this side of the mountain and one field on that side of the valley. And they move their cattle usually every couple months. To me, this still sort of falls into the continuous range, although maybe it's not as bad as other places. And that basically means that as long as the cows are in the field or cattle are in the field, they're going to pick and choose what they want, and they're going to go over and get all the baby growth the entire time, compacting the soil. They're probably in there while it's wet, compacting it. There's just a lot of negative downsides to the continuous grazing. Whereas there are these newer, maybe they're not new, but newer to the public discussion of like adaptive multi-paddock grazing, where you're moving cattle every couple of days to every few hours, depending on your size, where they are able to graze the pasture evenly. They're not on it for too long. And a common saying you hear is to take half and leave half, where you let them eat about half the height of the soil, and then they trample some of it in, which contributes that carbon input back into the soil, and also their manure. So it's kind of like you leave a little, take a little, and then you keep them moving on. And that might seem almost like a waste of grass, but the cool thing about it is that it's able to regrow faster, so you can come back to it sooner. Hopefully still within like, give it a rest of like 30 to 60 days, I think is about the range. But it takes more time and planning, but you'll see a lot better results. And so this is that pasture compaction ratio with the penetrometer versus a continuously grazed pasture in the orange, versus the gray is the same pasture, but where they excluded grazing. They put a little cage over it just to see what happened. And a lot of stuff I've read in the past have made it sound like compaction is this like crazy hard thing to fix. It takes years and years and years. When they excluded the small patch from grazing, they almost got back up to baseline within the one grazing season, which I feel like is a much needed little spiff of hope in there. So resting pastures does a lot of good for your soil structure. So once you have management under control, or maybe like while you're working on it, soil fertility and nutrient management, I think, are the second most important things that we manage for. Generally, the happier the plants are, the happier the soil is going to be, because those plants are feeding the soil. And in West Virginia, where we have a lot of pastures that are either severely under-fertilized, a few in certain places are over-fertilized with certain elements, and then a lot of them are very acidic, you can tell that the plant life there is really struggling, and the only plants that really thrive there are weeds that we don't want. And so I won't go too deep into this as it's being covered in another module, but basically get a soil test and test regularly, usually once or twice a year. It's free through WVU. I think the Department of Ag in West Virginia also has a soil testing lab, or you can send it off for more thorough testing at other states. But most of them will give you a recommended amount, and then you can use that instead of just applying a random amount. That way you're not wasting money and time. Also, applying manure or compost serves multiple benefits, where you're adding those nutrients and you're improving the soil organic matter. It's because it's adding carbon, and that improves soil health more than chemical fertilizer alone if you do it regularly. And so one important thing I feel like I want to mention lastly on the fertility side is that not all manure and compost is created equal. Just like any chemical fertilizer, you should know what you're applying and at what rate you should apply it. So even though it's not a chemical fertilizer, there is a limit at which it stops being beneficial. And so doing your soil tests and knowing how much nutrients you need, and then you can also test your manure or compost and make it match in a way. And it's really important to know that like different types of livestock produce different types of manure. And that's particularly relevant in West Virginia, where a lot of producers use poultry manure. And poultry in particular has extremely high levels of phosphorus, which many of our pastures are deficient in. But at a certain point, that actually starts being detrimental to the pasture, where you get toxic levels of phosphorus. And in the picture there, you can see my coworker standing in a giant field of ragweed, because these pastures have hundreds of times more phosphorus in it than is recommended, because they apply poultry litter every year. And there's also environmental damage done that in the Eastern Panhandle draining into the Chesapeake Bay. So either way, it's not a good idea to just apply stuff willy-nilly. Make informed decisions and try and do your best. Okay, so after fertility sorted out and management sorted out, this is where we really come into my bread and butter. Unfortunately, I feel like it's still only the third most important thing, but it's still important. And that's that our pastures, a lot of our pastures in West Virginia really need renovated, i.e. reseeded. There's a lot of studies in the ecological research and in the agronomic research that suggests that having more diverse forage stands actually improves soil health. And by diversity, I mean things that we want to see, like legumes and native warm season grasses, and not necessarily weed diversity. So just keep that in mind for the next couple minutes. So how does it work? Why would planting more different types of things lead to better soil health? The main one is that it leads to more productive stands. So in West Virginia, we're in a transitional climate between like the warm south and the cold north. We actually have really hot summers and really cold winters, and then fall and spring where it's kind of in between. And yet our pastures are dominated by these cool season species where they peak in the spring and in the fall, and in the summer we get this slump period where things kind of settle down and they're not very productive. Well, when you have diverse pastures that have warm seasons in them, they kind of take over during the period while the cool seasons are slowing down. So you have more stable growth over the entire course of the year. They're also more resilient to drought, because something in that mix is probably going to withstand the drought or the super wet conditions, versus when you have one plant, it's like whatever that one plant feels about the situation is what's going to happen. There's no insurance policy. And so finally, the reason The research shows that soil carbon and soil organic matter go up with plant diversity because you're feeding those microbes a diverse root exudate cocktail, and it makes them go kind of crazy for it. And they multiply like crazy, and they die, and they stick to that soil carbon or the soil minerals that we talked about earlier at a greater rate. And this means more organic matter, more soil carbon and nitrogen that are available, your soil water holding capacity goes up, et cetera, et cetera. And so why is this relevant to West Virginia? Well, we did a survey of West Virginia pastures in 2023, which hasn't been done since the 70s. And we found that the West Virginia pastures are neither diverse or productive compared to surrounding states. We have a really, really high proportion of undesirable forbs or weeds, like ragweed and horse nettle, amongst others, and have very few legumes in most of our pastures, which probably indicates that most producers have not reseeded any of their pastures. They're just kind of working with what's there, / that they're probably overgrazing to a degree. And most of our pastures are dominated by tall fescue and or orchard grass, with a few pastures that are just dominated by some random cocktail of weeds. And this falls in line with our transition climate zone, where we're still dominated by cool season grasses, but actually a lot of these weeds are warm season annuals that are filling that niche by itself instead of us seeding stuff. The problem is what nature is providing with these warm season grasses, they're not very good forage. So we argue that we should renovate pastures in West Virginia to include native warm season grasses that are good forage to fill that ecological niche. And this is why we did an NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant that started in 2022, where we wanted to evaluate the ability of pasture diversification to improve soil health and enhance pasture productivity and nutritional quality in West Virginia. And this experiment's not quite done. We still have another year, but we're going to share a few notes from it. So we have 19 sites around the state, 3 of which are WVU farms, and the rest are all private cooperators. And at each site, every 1 acre pasture has 3 strips in it that are 1/3 of an acre each. One being a control pasture that nothing was done to, one being a traditional mix of orchard grass, fescuolium, red and white clover, and one being an experimental diverse mix of warm season grasses, cool season grasses, legumes, forbs, etc. And these were all fenced off in order to control and monitor grazing methods. And we've been soil and plant sampling these plots every year since then. This is what the plots look like from the air. You can clearly see the color difference between them. In this one, the control plot is closest to the road. The middle is the high diversity, and the right is the low diversity, which is primarily orchard grass, and why it has that nice blue color. But we had we did establish successful stands, and we're still monitoring them. We've seen a lot of chicory, clover come up. We've had success with eastern gamma grass, Indian grass, and big blue stem, primarily of the native warm season grasses. For the cool seasons, we did not seed tall fescue because it's mostly already there on a lot of these sites, and we figured it would come back on its own, which it did. But we've had a lot of success with tall oatgrass and the perennial ryegrass, the tetraploid variety we seeded. We also seeded some forbs to support the native biodiversity that are also good forage, like gray-headed coneflower and swamp sunflower. So just a little peek at the ongoing results. The existing literature says that after a couple of years, usually between 4 and 5 years, you start to see these effects of organic matter accumulation diverge on the high diversity plots. We're only 3 years in, so it's a little early, but the trends are already showing that the low diversity or the orchard grass dominant plots have kind of already reached their peak a little bit, and they're kind of leveling out on how much organic matter they are able to support, because those grasses grew really fast and established a good stand really quick, but they're not productive over time as we have drought and like flooding weather, and they're a little bit more sensitive. Whereas this high diversity plot, even in a year where we had our worst drought in 40 years, continued to increase at a much greater rate. Whereas the control plot didn't increase too much, but it should be noted that although we didn't do anything to the control plot, a lot of these plots were overgrazed to begin with, so when we fenced them off for the experiment, we actually still stored a bunch of organic matter just for doing that, just letting the plots rest and only be grazed every so often. So this kind of also illustrates that point that, yes, plant diversity is good and it's a good goal to strive for, but nothing is going to change if you don't have good management. So to conclude all of this, soil is alive, it's really complicated, and it's dynamic, but it's really, really important. And it's the basis of all long-term successful agricultural operations. Soil health is that balance between the soil biology, your soil fertility, and those physical properties like soil aggregation. In West Virginia, soil health is most threatened by compaction, erosion, low fertility, and overgrazing. And improving it starts with grazing management, and the rest will follow. Once grazing management improves, most of the pastures in West Virginia would probably benefit from reseeding, and preferably with diverse forages.
This virtual pasture walk is brought to you by the West Virginia Conservation Agency, funded through the NRCS Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative. For similar content, please visit grazingprofessionals.us.